Welcome back. This is lecture 3 of module 8. As you know, module 8 is the last module of the course. And so far we are primarily looking at, in this module we are looking at the recent developments in terms of the social and sociolinguistic nature of language use, and how the domain of cognition has also come together with sociolinguistics to look at broader, the same issues, but from a broader perspective, from the perspective of cognitive science, from neuroscience and other disciplines. So, today we will keeping the same thread today also we will discuss about social cognition in discourse. Discourse analysis we have already discussed in a previous module. Now, here we will look at how social cognition and discourse go hand in hand, and what are the some of the domains of study within that domain is what we will discuss today. Now, a relation of cognitive process and discourse is very interesting and intertwined domain. Now, discourse is embedded in the socio-cultural practice, any kind of discourse for that matter. What are the larger socio-cultural backdrop, what are the kind of patterns that are followed, any discourse is always situated within that. So, as a result of which it makes immense sense to study discourse from a socio-cognitive perspective, and that is what we are doing here. So, this refers to the role culture plays in social behavior and its cognition. So, we will quote Walker here, the study of cognition should take place within its natural context of interaction. So, that is what is the most important. So, any kind of interaction is part of the natural domain. So, in the typical social backdrop, we will be interacting with multiple different kinds of people. So, any kind of discourse must take into account those extra linguistic information about the social structure, what can be said, what cannot be said, what kind of style is required for any kind of particular setup and so on. So, as a result of which understanding discourse in the natural context is very important. Now, there are many names, many important names. One of them is of course Van Dyck. He is of the opinion that social cognition is a central parameter of any critical analysis of discourse. So, discourse, of course, we understand discourse because we have already looked at it before. Now, any kind of discourse analysis must take into account the social cognition part. Now, when we talk about social cognition in discourse, this has been there in social psychology, and there are all these different domains that are studied within this larger broader domain. So, various domains, for example, social perception, impression management, attitude change and persuasion, attribution, categorization, intergroup relations, stereotypes, all of these different kinds, social representation. All of these different types of domains have been studied within social psychology, and we can also study them from the socio-linguistic perspective, from in the perspective of discourse, taking social cognition as an important parameter. Now, when we do that, there are of course multiple domains, but some of these domains are more popular, or they have been studied more. So, TV reality shows, commercials, memorials, political debates, oral narratives, technical tests, and even today of course, we also have digital stories. So, depending on the domain, depending on the target audience, the discourse will automatically change, and how those are also, how do they have a close relationship with the socio-cultural, socio-cognitive processes, that is what are studied. Now, social cognition and discourse, when we break it down, so it does not only refer to the observable verbal or non-verbal features or social interaction and speech acts, but it also talks about, it also points to the cognitive representation and strategies involved during the production and comprehension of discourse. So, any kind of discourse will have, naturally it will have two parts, you will have comprehension and you will have production. Now, when that is happening, we do not study only what is observable or what is audible. So, it is not only the language that you hear, but also the underlying cognitive representations that make itself clear through the discourse. That is also something that is studied, and that is where the whole idea of social cognition comes in. This way, discourse often signifies analyze the mental processes and representations involved in the conversation. So, our underlying ideas about a person, about an event, about a place or whatever it may be, it comes from some amount of mental representation that we already might have, and that is what we are talking about here. So, this takes us to the domain of social cognition. So, what is social cognition then? It is defined as a socially shared system of social representations that includes a set of strategies for their effective manipulation in interpretation, interaction and discourse. So, what are the kind of mental categories we have, or you can call them social representations that we have in our mind, which we not only utilize, this is something that is an ongoing dynamic process. So, we do have categories, we do have representations in the mind that have been created out of some kind of experience, and every time we have new discourse, new interaction, new kinds of interpretation of a situation, those models, those representations get updated all the time. So, it is a continuous loop that we engage in, all human societies do engage in. So, that is the entire domain of social cognition. Now, the interplay, so let us just look at it a bit more in detail. So, this research aligns with the schema theory that we have probably discussed before, and shows that stereotypes, remember we talked about stereotypes and prototypes. So, schema theory and stereotypes, these are what we discuss, and shared knowledge are reproduced in society through discourse. So, the kind of schema that you have in your mind, the individual versus the social schemas and the stereotypes, all of that. So, the reproduction of social cognition requires considering both cognitive processes, mental representation and strategies, and social dimension. So, it is not only the social process, but also the cognitive process, that is what we study. The study of discourse in social psychology highlights the interplay between cognition and social interaction. So, basically this will link the individual representation to group dominance, ideology and social structure. So, it is a very nuanced, it plays out in a layered way, individual representation, social representation, the interaction and their schematic representation in the brain, and so on and so forth. So, one of the representations that we are interested in this domain is called social representation. Now, how is it structured? So, it can be understood as hierarchical networks organized by a limited set of relevant node categories, and this is located in the semantic memory. So, memory in psychology, memory is understood to be of it has the multiple divisions. So, you have long term memory, short term memory, and then you have semantic memory, episodic memory, procedural memory and so on and so forth. So, various kinds. So, this idea of the social representation is represented in the semantic memory. The categories that might include are appearance, origin, socio-economic goals, cultural dimension, personality and many other things. Not all of them are applicable in every society, but largely you get the idea that these are broadly the categories that are represented. These organize the propositional content of the SR. SR is social representation, combining shared knowledge with evaluative information. Shared knowledge as in shared within the society, within that particular setup. Now, in this domain there are, as I said, there are many important scholars, but we will be able to discuss only few. So, Van Dyck is is a name that we have discussed before also. So, today also we will see some of his work. So, his method of CDA is critical discourse analysis. So, he is known, he is very well known, one of the most well known scholars in the field of media discourse studies. Now, he studied discourse in both domains of language, which is comprehension as well as production. So, when we are talking about any kind of discourse, always we have to keep in mind that there are two parts to it. You have comprehension and you have production. So, and he has studied both of them using different kinds of parameters, different kinds of tools. So, both the narrative comprehension and narrative production are studied through the method of critical discourse analysis. Now, what are the methods that he uses? He uses both structural, social and cognitive analysis, thereby giving it a holistic picture. So, it's not only what kind of grammatical rules are applied, what kind of structural properties are typical for one particular kind of media discourse, that tells us only half the story. So, what Van Dyck studies typically do is they take into account the linguistic structure, at the same time they also take into account the social and the cognitive analysis. So that you get the entire picture at one place. So, grammar, phonology, morphology, semantics, as well as the higher level property like forms and dimensions of the text. Not only that, he also takes into account the ideological positioning in narrative very seriously and analyzes them using social context and cognitive mechanism, because as he says, collective social behavior are derived from abstract mental systems. The way the society behaves, and a particular society might behave like an organism. Now, that organism has certain kinds of mental representation or schematic representation about certain categories, and that they all share. So, that has to come from particular sort of an abstract mental representation or mental system or cognitive system, you can call this. So, that is why he takes into account all of these different parameters to analyze any kind of discourse. Media discourse is his most famous contribution. So, this abstract mental representation arising out of social action and interaction are responsible for creating mental representation of individuals. Now, these representation he calls models. Models are nothing but the schematic representation of a situation and its how it should be in any interactive scenario, how that schema should interact with the social stimulus and what is the cognitive representation and all that. So, that is what he calls the whole thing he calls model. Now, these models in turn what do? They determine an individual's behavior, speech or written communication. So, depending on, of course, this is almost commonsensical, depending on the notions you have in your mind about people, about things, about ideas, about certain social practices will help you behave in a particular way, and this is also true for linguistic performance, be it understanding or be it production. So, an independent interpretation of the activities of the other individuals in the society. So, not only your own, but also of the others. Other important names of course, are that of Odak and Fairclough. They focused more on the social processes at work in their analysis of discourse, as language manifests social processes and interaction. So, their focus has been more on the social process as opposed to Van Dyck, who gave a lot of importance to cognitive processes as well. So, social and cognitive in case of Van Dyck, in case of Odak and Fairclough more focus was on social processes. Now, there are models that have been proposed, they are called situation models. Now, these models are cognitive representation of personal experiences and interpretation, such as personal knowledge and opinions also. Now, this entire thing is located in the episodic memory, represents the interpretations that individuals make of other persons' specific events and actions, serve as the cognitive counterpart of situation. So, basically what models typically do, this is what they are also talking about, though based on so most of the cases, if you are talking about models in a cognitive sense, it is created out of experiences. So, depending on the times that you have experienced a particular scenario, you will be constantly updating that system. So, as a result, in the end the schema will get more and more rich, but the model remains the same. You have additional information every time you have something new added to it. That is how the model works, and the same way these situation models also work. They help construct or update a mental representation when witnessing, reading or hearing about events. Now, this is about situation model. So, these are episodic or context models are a specific type of situation model created during communication about the current interaction, and it features knowledge and opinion about self, about other, goals of the interaction and important social dimension of the current situation. Basically, all the relevant nodes of information that you need without the details. So, you need the baseline, you need the schematic understanding, and that goes into creating the model. Now, let us see some domains where these ideas have been utilized and studied. One of them, most important of them, is the domain of prejudice. How is prejudice studied in terms of discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis. So, how ethnic prejudice, this is one of the most commonly cited ones, most studied, represented and manipulated. So, how does everybody has some kind of prejudice in them, every society has, be it racial, be it gender based or some kind of prejudice. So, ethnic prejudices is how is it represented and how is it used, that is what have been studied a lot. For example, in the white group member of western multi-ethnic societies, this have been studied. Categories of prejudice, attitude, schemata. So, what are the schema that we have? Origin, appearance, socio-economic goal, socio-cultural norms, values and personality. These are typically the categories of prejudiced attitude. So, ethnic prejudice are general knowledge or opinion that the majority group tend to have about the minority group on what they look like, where they come from, why are they here. A lot of studies are going on. There have been already many studies, but also some important studies are going on about the situation about various kinds of immigrant population. So, the way they are understood, the way they are the discourse about them in the media is tells us about the underlying schemata, that is the schemata that we are talking about here. So, those schemas actually tell us about the prejudices that we have about a certain ethnic group, that is what ethnic prejudice is. So, examples, for example, blue collar workers in the western countries, in US for example, emphasize material threat from the immigrants or minorities, and educated groups focus on cultural deficiency, symbolic or modern racism. So, depending on the group, it is also possible that the target group might be the same, the ethnic group about whom they have those schema, that depends on the where you are in the social structure. So, blue collar workers might have a material threat perception, on the other hand the others, the educated groups might focus on the cultural deficiencies and other such things. So, this is how do we know that? We know it from the language use. So, prejudice schemata shape how dominant group members interpret experience with minorities. These interpretations often involve biased causal attributions such as blaming minorities for social problems or reversing victim roles and so on. Prejudiced SR, social representation in talk and text. So, function of prejudiced communication to share and normalize in-group membership and allegiance, or to exchange practical information to deal with minority groups. So, this could be one domain where we see this. This is the domain where we discuss these things, and these are the ideas. So, strategies would be use of context model. People avoid open or overt racism. They use tactics like positive self representation or face keeping. For example, I am not a racist, but there have been these problems. Don't get me wrong, but I must tell you this, like this. So, basically taking the blame off oneself, but while still acting on the prejudiced opinion. So, that is what the domain is. So, it shows that everyday discourse reflects underlying cognitive models. Similarly, other discourse aspects like hesitation, corrections and false starts etc. indicate strategic cognitive monitoring for impression management. This is in a nutshell what prejudice, how prejudice as a category can be studied or are being studied within the domain of discourse analysis. Then comes the domain of persuasion. Persuasion, classical research on persuasion and attitude change by Hovland and associates. They look at the nature and order of arguments and their effect on persuasion. So, what is the language of persuasion basically? So, limitations, neglect of systematic theory of persuasive discourse, lack of detailed cognitive processing models, and confusion between personal opinion and socially shared opinion. These are some ideas that have been on the basis of which there have been some criticism, some limitations. However, this is also an important domain of study. So, modern perspectives, they say that persuasive discourse does not directly cause opinion change. Intervening thoughts like pro and con arguments are essential in opinion change, and then the remaining challenge is to specify the thoughts and how they are represented cognitively and the strategies. So, bottom line is that in this domain of research, the most common challenge is that they do not take cognitive models very seriously. Then comes the domain of impression management. This focuses on how discourse shapes transformations in mental models, the presence of positive self description, or performance of verbal acts like greetings or self discourse and so on. So, basically how do you create a the impression management, how you create positive self image in the mind of your addressee. So, that is the idea. So, aggressive or radical positions may trigger negative evaluation. So, that is why people tend to talk, then tend to watch their language. For example, when talking about minorities, people often mitigate statements or avoid sensitive topics to maintain social acceptability. So, even though people might have certain kinds of cognitive models underlying, they still then there are all these other kinds of social parameters according to which they ultimately use the language in discourse. So, that is what the interaction shows us. Now, let us see some examples, some studies that have been carried out, some very well known classic studies within the domain of social cognition and how it fares with Grice's maxims of Grice, cooperative principles, that those experiments we will see. Now, all of us know what the maxims of Grice are, but anyway we will look at them again. So, the following are the maxims. So, quantity, quality, manner and relation, these are the 4 parameters. Idea is that in any kind of communication, rules of communication, rules of conversation are that we should provide only that much information as required, we should be truthful and provide evidence, the manner should be clear and there should be no ambiguity, no obscurity, and then relation. So, whatever we say should be relevant to the exchange, the kind of conversation that is going on, our contribution to the conversation should be related to that rather than something completely different. So, these are the primary parameters on which the understanding of cooperative competence is concerned. So, that is what Grice's maxims are. Now, these maxims are typically supposed to underlie any kind of conversational structure ideally. Now, this is what the ideal scenario is. However, in the real world, though not all conversations go like that. So, the way Grice puts it is that all conversations should follow this and do follow this, and when we do not follow these things, that is when the different kinds of understanding, different kinds of reading of the same sentence. So, for example, using metaphors or being sarcastic, all of these sometimes violate those rules. Sometimes conversations do not follow the maxims. In some cases, the idea here is that because cooperation is the most important goal here, so the proposal is that listeners still understand the utterance as they believe that the speaker's utterance must be relevant, because we take it for granted that it has to be relevant. So, what happens is that suppose it is not relevant, suppose it is not really directly connected, listeners, because they believe it must be relevant, so they create a meaning out of it. That is what the idea is. So, they proceed to find out the real meaning and generate relevance in that situation. So, all these indicate the cooperative principles at work in any communicative event. That is what different kinds of communicative events go. Now, many socio-cognitive phenomena are partly products of people following these interpersonal rules for language use. Now, Grice's principles have been checked through experiments in social cognition, most notably in the domain of cooperativeness. There are many important studies. So, in the experimental setup, sometimes participants even create unintended implicatures to make the experimenter's instructions seem meaningful. Sometimes because we think that the maxims are what we are working on, because the conversation is relevant. A famous example for that is given is that of the can you pass the salt, could you please pass the salt in a dinner table. Now, the person who is asking this question does not really is not really questioning the addressee's ability to pass the salt. So, here we are violating the relevance principle, because this is not relevant, that is not, let us say some other discussion was going on and then nobody suddenly asks whether somebody can pass the salt. Now, the listener obviously understands that this is not directly relevant to the ongoing discussion, but because the underlying principle is cooperation. So, the listener understands that the author must be meaning something else. So, they derive the secondary meaning, that is what we are trying to say here. So, even when the maxims are overtly not followed, or let us say overtly violated, the listener often creates meaning or looks for relevance or creates relevance. That is what has been studied in a laboratory setup. So, they try to see explicit irrelevant information and implicit irrelevant information. They give irrelevant information and try to see that whether the subjects were creating relevance or not. So, though two kinds can be there, implicit and explicit. Irrelevance can be of two types, implicit and explicit. So, in the domain of explicit irrelevant information, there are again multiple topics. So, representativeness heuristic, that is what Kahneman and Tversky's classic study of the use of representativeness was studied. Then comes the dilution effect. This checks the operation of conversation pragmatics. So, this refers to the reduction in the weight given to diagnostic information when the information is diluted with non-diagnostic information. Similarly, we have the domain of attributions, we have the domain of eyewitness testimony. All of these are studied within the explicit irrelevant information processing using social cognition within the social cognition domain. Similarly, we have implicit irrelevant information that has also been studied. Some classic studies have to do with the question wording, response scales, and then also shifting standard model, conjunction fallacy, and so on. So, question wording, basically the idea here is that depending on the question is worded, the memory of an event might change. So, a famous example is here, how fast was the car going when it smashed the truck. There are two possible ways of wording it. One sentence can use the word smashed, the other can use the word hit. Now, what they found out was participants remembered the car travelling at a faster speed when the verb used was smashed compared to when the verb used was hit. So, the word smash automatically presupposes the speeding car. That is what they found out, and this was implicit irrelevant information, that is what they were studying. Similarly, response scales. So, there are various kinds of scales that are used. Response scale used in experiments have been found to affect the response depending on the kind of scale that we use. For example, in yet another famous study, respondents were far more likely to indicate watching television for 2.5 hours or more a day when high frequency alternatives were provided. So, 0.5 hour increment starting at 2.5. So, when the scale starts at 2.5 and then 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5 like this 0.5 hour interval, and when this is how the scale is, many participants, very large number of participants actually gave 2.5 as the answer. However, if you change the scale and then change the frequency scale and 0.5 increment, but starting at 0.5, then they will give the answer as 0.5, not 2.5. So, the way the scale is presented is what seems to have an impact on the way the response is. Now, this response is a cognitive process, right? It is, but depending on the way the information is given. Then shifting standard model, this is participants show a shift in rating on the basis of whether the rating is objective or it is subjective, depending on the kind of rating. So, Likert scale for example, which is subjective, there they had one kind of answer, but if it is an objective scale like reporting weight in pounds, then it is more objective. So, there is no such stereotype that worked. Similarly, conjunction fallacy. So, conjunction fallacy is again a very interesting domain. Description of a person is followed by a set of questions regarding the probability of certain outcomes. So, most famous of them is called the Linda problem. Now, here the questions with a conjunction is often preferred, the kind of questions that are asked. So, Linda was a student and she was also an activist. So, this kind of options are generally preferred as opposed to where there is no conjunction. So, these are very interesting studies in the domain of social cognition. To sum up, we can say that now whether in laboratory setup or in public discourse, language use has been studied through the lens of social cognition for a long time now. And so, be it conversation pragmatics or critical discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis may take up any kind of form. Media discourse is one of the most popular one, but there are many many other political debates and so on. So, there you can actually look at from the structural perspective as well as how those structures represent the underlying social representation or cognitive models in the mind of the both the speaker as well as the audience. So, sometimes the speaker adjusts the mental model in order to converge with that of the audience. So, there are multiple these various domains of study that are there in the, and it is still going on. This is though this started some time back, this area is still very popular and lots of interesting studies are going on. So, this is one interesting domain that I wanted to tell you about. So, this is where we end lecture 3. In lecture 4, we will take up some more such areas, similar areas. Thank you.